Hello and welcome to Blogging Theology, everyone. And I'm very honored to have back on Blogging Theology, Dr. Lawrence B. Brown. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you. Always nice to be here.
Good to see you again. Now, a couple of days ago, I invited Dr. Bart Ehrman and Dr. Lawrence Brown to discuss God, suffering, and the purpose of life. It was a fascinating exchange of views, and afterwards, reading the comments below about the dialogue or debate, as it actually became, between Dr. Ehrman and Dr. Brown, I noticed there was a general feeling that Dr. Brown was cut off a number of times. One commentator I read said, and I quote, "If only Dr. Bart would let Dr. Brown speak." As it would have been nice to hear the rest of what Dr. Brown had to say, I invited him back today. So welcome back, Dr. Brown. Now, would you like to perhaps expand on those themes that you perhaps you felt you weren't able to address in greater detail last time?
Yeah, I think that would be a good exercise. But in doing so, before doing so, I guess one thing I would like to say is that I have a lot of respect for Dr. Ehrman as a biblical textual critic and a scholar, and I think that it's kind of unfortunate that we got off the tracks and went from a dialogue to a debate, and that things became rather contentious. But having said that, yeah, I think there are some things that it would be fair to allow me to finish. In particular, I would like to say what I have to say about my mentioning of the near-death experiences, or the so-called near-death experiences. Also, the point that I was trying to make about how atheists, in the end, although they would be shy to admit it, but they do tend to turn towards the supernatural when they run out of any other explanations. The third point just concerns the issue of knowledge versus faith when it comes to religion, which Dr. Ehrman challenged me on. And then the fourth is basically a summing up regarding the main issues, which I think actually were not given enough or adequate time. So let me start off with my talk, or what I would like to say about near-death experiences. But if you don't mind, Paul, before I do that, one thing I do want to mention is that I know there are a certain number of people out there who are trying to get in touch with me. The fact of the matter is that I am a bit of a recluse, and I like it that way. But I am offering my email just for anybody who feels that they strongly want to be in touch. I recently had a translator who was translating my book my books into a foreign language, and she had been trying to find me for 2 years, and I just don't want to repeat that experience. No. So if you don't mind, I will just mention that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, anybody who wants to reach me can reach me at askdrbrown@yahoo.com. And that's Ask Dr. just Dr. Brown, no periods or anything like that. So askdrbrown@yahoo.com. So having said that, shall we launch into
Please.
it?
Yeah, no, it's very kind of you. Please go ahead.
Okay, so on the subject of so-called near-death experiences or out-of-body experiences, I have to say first that I thought it was kind of funny that Dr. Ehrman said he did not consider anecdotal evidence to be evidence. But then why do you call it anecdotal evidence?
Yeah, I thought it was
kind of amusing, but in any case, I do get his point. He's trying to narrow the field to what might strictly be considered more empirical evidence. But in any case, my position is that the sheer number of out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences have moved such narratives from the realm of anecdotal evidence to really accepted evidence in many circles. And it's just by force of numbers, by reliability of the people relating the stories. Many of them are high intellectuals, many of them are doctors, lawyers, architects, engineers, etc. People who you would expect to be knowledgeable and trustworthy. And it's especially true that we should give these stories credence in light of the cross-cultural commonalities, not the cross-cultural differences. Cross-cultural differences, it's not surprising to find those, and Dr. Bart alluded to that. But it's the cross-cultural commonalities, the common experiences that people have had around the world that unite these stories under an umbrella of authenticity. Now, there was one commenter who I would quote from, and they wrote a comment that said, quote, "I found it weird that Dr. Brown uses the idea of NDEs, near-death experiences, to prove his beliefs, ... end quote. But that completely misses the point. I do not use near-death experiences to support my faith. All I was saying is that near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences suggest the presence of a soul. At this point in our discussion, what I was trying to establish was the evidence for a creator, because quite frankly, the discussion of the point of pain and suffering in our world cannot really be adequately addressed unless a person believes in a God to begin with and believes in an afterlife. It's very difficult to give any kind of sensible argument if you are not coming from that foundation. So my point was that if we're going to admit the presence of a soul, we pretty much have to admit the presence of a transcendentally supreme creator. And I think that near-death experiences provide a great deal of evidence for the soul. But I do not use near-death experiences to justify my faith. And in fact, I strongly question what is going on behind the near-death experience and out-of-body experience. To begin with, out-of-body experiences have been reported by many people who were not in the stages of death, some of them completely conscious. Now, the common experience of allegedly meeting Jesus Christ or feeling oneself to be in the presence of God goes against the Islamic view of the afterlife. Roughly 90% of near-death experiences are pleasant and ethereal, but about 10% are dark and scary. Now, those are not the numbers you would expect as a cross-section of society where the majority of people are disbelievers. I would point out that according to Islamic traditions, the things I just mentioned call the entire near-death experience or out-of-body experience into a certain question. Basically, what really is going on here? There are things that are profoundly un-Islamic. The issue of allegedly meeting Jesus Christ, standing in the presence of the divine, and so on. But one thing I would suggest is this. One possible way of making sense of it, and Allah knows best, is that according to Islamic traditions, the soul separates from the body during sleep. Perhaps something along those lines is happening during periods of severe psychological stress. And just as the soul can experience a prophetic dream from God, a dream from our own imagination, a nafsi dream, or a nightmare or even a deceptive dream from the shaitan, perhaps so too the soul can be pulled in different directions during an out-of-body experience. That would certainly explain what we might readily understand to be delusions fostered during an out-of-body experience. Delusions such as I just mentioned, feeling that you're in the presence of God. But remember, my point was solely to suggest that near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences validate the existence of a soul. And if you're going to go there, by extension, you pretty much have to start to believe in a creator. And that was the main point, not to validate or not to use near-death experiences to validate Islam. I would never do that.
I reminded of a conversation I had with a Baptist preacher, friend of mine, who also has a PhD in theology, and he's a minister of a church here in London. And he had exactly the same view as you, actually, but from an evangelical Christian view. He said, well, many of these NDEs, you have Catholics, meeting Mary and other things, and of course, you wouldn't have approved of that. And it didn't fit in with his worldview about what happens after death anyway, with believers and unbelievers, Christians and non-Christians. So he was similarly skeptical about these the religious content of them, although we didn't go into the out-of-body experience and the content that is relayed in those experiences, which turns out to be reliable by independent checkers. But I don't want to anticipate what you're going to say.
Well, yeah, I mean, exactly, pretty much. That's very reinforcing. Thank you. That's interesting to hear that from a Baptist minister.
Yeah, he said that to me. I mentioned his name, but I haven't asked him to if I could mention that conversation.
No, better to stay away from those things.
But he said he's very real, very, very much a pastor in London, who I still know, by the way. Yeah.
Well, for those of us who are listening to this podcast who are Muslim, I mean, I think many of us have had the experience of waking up from a dream and saying, was that dream from my mind? Was that dream from the shaitan? Was that dream from Allah? Especially if we have prayed istikhara about an issue and are agonizing in a decision-making process, and then we get a dream that seems to be providing guidance. Well, the first thing we really want to know is, where is that guidance coming from? Was that dream giving us guidance from Allah? Or is the shaitan trying to deceive us? So I'm just suggesting that perhaps in near-death experiences, we're having something of a similar nature going on. Perhaps just as the soul separates from the body during sleep, the soul separates from the body during periods of severe psychological stress, not even always unconscious, stress, like the person is out from, being under anesthesia or having had a heart attack or something of that sort. So in any case, why don't we move on?
Yeah, are you going to mention more about near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences, or because I wanted to add something if you were going to move on?
No, please go ahead. No, that was it. I was going to move on to something else. Yeah.
Okay, no, that's fine. One of the things, not really my role to disagree with Bart Ehrman, but my own opinion was, and other people may have thought so as well, when he dismissed NDE accounts as anecdotal, basically subjective, not worthy of scientific credibility. But many of these out-of-body experiences, you yourself mentioned, Dr. Brown, have extraordinary claims that people born blind had out-of-body experiences, either as NDEs or at other times in their lives. And yet they reported being spatially aware. They reported seeing various activities going around in the surgery, in the hospital, or wherever. And they recovered, obviously, and were still blind. But these claims can be tested empirically. You can simply say, well, you claim to have seen all this. What happened? Who else was present? Did the doctor, did the surgeon, did the nurse also? Did they do these things that are claimed to have been done? So it's not anecdotal in that sense. It's empirically testable data. And if as it has indeed been shown, I understand, that these out-of-body experiences do correlate accurately with actually what happened in a way that it was impossible for the observer, the person who was having the out-of-body experience, to see in it by any normal physical laws of physics, then that for me is evidence. Now, we may not understand it, we may not have an explanation for it as neurologists or doctors or nurses, that's not the point. The point is that it's not just anecdotal if it can be empirically tested. And it has been empirically tested. Therefore, I would submit, Dr. Brown, that your relaying of that argument is actually a valid one. It has legs, basically.
I don't think we can really say it can be empirically tested, in that you can't induce the state and reproduce the state and so on. But I think what you can do is you can validate the story. I mean, definitely. Yeah. And the example of the person who's born blind and then relating relating in their near-death experience, relating things that could only be known if a person had spiritual awareness, and as if they were seeing. That's a rather extreme example. I think a much more common example is the person who has an out-of-body experience from severe trauma, or from a coronary event, or during anesthesia. And many times these are instances where the eyes are not open. Under anesthesia, the eyes are closed. I mean, if the person is on the body, right, the head is covered. Cannot see what's going on. The eyes are actually, during surgery, the eyes are taped closed, closed, so that the corneas do not desiccate and get damaged. Many patients who are comatose, the same thing. The eyes are taped closed. Definitely trauma patients and so on. I think one of the easiest ways I can talk about this is just the old Chinese adage: I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, I do and I understand. We can talk about these things, and somebody who has never experienced a near-death experience will be much more skeptical than somebody who has had a friend or two who has experienced near-death experiences and can relate it to you in a convincing, coherent way. Now, I have had a number of people relate their near-death experiences to me. I have had three that really stand out, and many more, of course, that I've just heard heard on the internet and so on. But when you actually sit with a person and see the range of emotions on their face, it on an emotional level it validates it. But there are more important things that validate it, as you said, correlating what the person described with what actually happened. I mean, people come back from near-death experiences saying, telling the joke that the doctor told, or saying how people were moving in the room, or even telling about, like, one of the people, the first person who ever related a near-death experience to me. She was hit by a car as a pedestrian. Her chest was split open. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Now, she was lying, bloodied, with an open chest on the street, pronounced dead, and she was able to come back and talk about what people were saying 2 or 3 blocks away, because she had this experience of rising up to the levels of the cloud, looking back on the scene, but at the same time being able to focus in on details. And she was able to come back relating what people 2 or 3 blocks away were saying and doing in response to seeing, the accident and her lying there, appearing to be dead. Now, one thing I would say is that I don't like the terminology near-death experience, because, of course, we know in Islam, you're either alive or dead. Out-of-body experience, I think, is perhaps more accurate.
Okay. Well, thanks for that. So you're going to move on perhaps to the next area that you wanted to discuss in more detail.
Dr. Ehrman did object to my statement that atheists sometimes turn to the supernatural for explanations that they cannot cover with science. Now, I just want to remind everybody what supernatural means. Supernatural means, and I'm just going to use my little cheat sheet here, okay? But Oxford Dictionary, it means of or caused by power above the forces of nature. Of or caused by power above the forces of nature. Now, this necessarily draws into the discussion, is God part of nature? Where do you draw the line between what is what is above the forces of nature and what is part of nature? So this necessarily brings into question what is within the forces of nature and what is a power above the forces of nature. And in particular, is God part of nature, or is God a power above the forces of nature? And my argument would be that as God created nature, God is above the forces of nature, which he himself created. But where else do you draw the line? What do you consider supernatural? Do you consider, the many things that people have spoken about, ghosts, poltergeists, what do you call supernatural? Well, let me give you my concept here. What I felt that I did not really get to fully explain is this. Whether atheists try to explain the origin of our universe with a mysterious, unknown quantum event, fluctuating quantum field, so so-called God particle, a singularity, or whatever, these explanations transcend natural causes and fall into the realm of the supernatural, i.e., powers of or above the forces of nature. This is certainly true, and perhaps most true, with regard to the explanation that life was originally introduced to planet Earth via organic molecules that constituted the building blocks of life. Now, that's the theory of abiogenesis. There's also the theory that primitive life forms, known as extremophiles, were introduced into Earth, and that's where life came from, and that's the theory of panspermia. According to these theories, Earth was seeded with either the building blocks of life or life itself, transported on space dust, meteors, comets, asteroids, and some people even say aliens, either intentionally or unintentionally. Now, let's not poo-poo the theories, okay? Let's just admit that the theories are there. The theory of panspermia in its various forms has been discussed or alluded to by Francis Crick of DNA fame, Richard Dawkins, and Neil deGrasse Tyson, to mention a few. It's still the subject of research worldwide. So I have to say, no, Dr. Ehrman, this is a live topic and is yet to be resolved. I see that Dr. Ehrman considers the concept to be easily dismissed. And personally, I do too. I agree with him on this point. But the point is that some very prominent scientists have discussed the possibility and or endorsed the theory that research is ongoing. And all of this just basically means that they are so desperate for an answer that they go to unreasonable extremes. Because the theory fails to answer the question, where did life come from? Well, Dr. Ehrman himself points out how the answer doesn't work, because the answer is, where did life come from? Outer space. Where did that level of outer space get it? Well, from more outer space. And where did they get it? From someplace else in outer space. Or if you're going to say aliens, then they got it from other aliens, et cetera, et cetera. So, Dr. Ehrman himself pointed out that this is just one more unanswerable chain of infinite regress, and it deserves to be dismissed. And yes, I agree, it deserves to be dismissed. But my point is that atheists, when unable to answer a question, sometimes go to pretty ridiculous arguments, and the research continues. They have not dropped this subject yet. They continue to work on this subject in major universities around the world.
Okay. I thought Dr. Bart Ehrman's most rhetorically powerful points, and where he was clearly energized very passionately, even vitriolic at times perhaps, was over the issue of suffering, human suffering in the world. And he seemed to think that meant that God didn't exist. And I think that's where he became, he himself said he went ballistic. That was the word he used for me. That wasn't my word, that's his word. The very idea that God could exist and there should be suffering in this world. And I thought that's where a lot of the pushback on you, where you were kind of interrupted quite a bit, took place in perhaps the latter half of the session. Did you want to revisit that question today?
Well, I do, and actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that actually was the turning point in the discussion, and I noticed that also. I just kind of wanted to dismiss the other few things, if you don't mind, before I get to this.
Please.
The other point I wanted to touch on was just that Dr. Ehrman stated, and here I'm going to quote. So he stated, "I don't think anybody reasons themselves into faith. I think they experience themselves into faith." Now, that might be true for some people, and maybe even for most people. So I wouldn't argue the point, well, much. But I have to say that for myself, it was a combination of experience and reason. And I'm going to come back to that. But roughly 20 minutes later in the talk, Dr. Ehrman said this, quote, "You started out by insisting that it's not faith seeking understanding, it's understanding seeking faith. And that reason is what led you to faith. Now you're saying you have faith, but you don't know the reason. You don't know the reason for the biggest problem we have. Why is there suffering?" The point I would like to make here is that there is a huge difference between knowing the reason why I became Muslim and knowing the divine reason behind suffering. The first concerns something I did, becoming a Muslim. I know why I did that. The second concerns something Allah does, design his creation. I know I came to belief through a combination of experience and reason, but I don't know why Allah does everything he does. Only Allah can know that. And it's funny that you should lead into this, because this is exactly what I was getting to myself. Because with regard to the reason for suffering, I can say the Islamic position is that God did create evil in the sense that we all have the capacity and means to commit evil. A gun can be used for hunting, but it also can be used for murder. Hands have been used to build civilization, but they are also employed in the commission of horrific crimes. I mean, the equipment that men come with, that we're born with, right, can be used for procreation, but it can also be used for violent rape. The point is that God gives us tools and commands us through revelation to do good and to abstain from evil. But nonetheless, evil at some level exists. And the evil people among us manifest that evil.
And I think if I could just jump in there, when he kept on repeating like a mantra, the innocent person dying of hunger, starvation, the child dying of starvation and hunger. Well, this links in with what you've just said, arguably, in that we have now many times over the capacity to feed everyone on earth from our vast riches now as a global community. But people are still dying of hunger and starvation. It's not that they need to die from starvation, that they are not being fed by those of us who live in the first world who can have the resources, the capacity, the logistics, the money to do that. And so if people are suffering, it's because other people are not helping them, because they needn't suffer. It's unnecessary. No one needs to starve. And so this is an example of perhaps human evil or negligence, criminal negligence even, rather than, and it plays into a human problem rather than a divine problem.
I agree, and actually, I don't think I could have put it better. It's not God's problem; it's our problem. Basically, evil people, the evil people among us, will manifest that evil, and the faithful struggle against both committing evil themselves and to correct evil wherever it is found. That's basically the test upon us, isn't it? The test is not only to abstain from committing evil ourselves, but also to correct evil wherever it is found.
So it's not inevitable, this suffering. It's not natural. It is a man-made problem with a man-made solution. and a man-made possibility and a man-made responsibility as well. And that's part of, you say, the test that, Islamically speaking, is part of what it is to be human on this planet. Our species is here to perform certain tasks, to meet certain challenges, and not just to have a good time.
Well, now on that, I would disagree. I think it is inevitable. And this is a point that I was making during the talk. It really depends on what you see as being the purpose for life. I mean, if your concept is that this life should be paradise on earth, then then I can get why you would be dissatisfied. But I would question why. Why do you feel you deserve it? And what has anybody done to deserve paradise on earth? If your paradigm is that this life is a testing ground that sorts out the worthy from the unworthy, well, you can't do that without a test, right? I mean, look at it this way. I mean, if there was no hunger, if there was no suffering, then you don't get any reward for helping the person who is suffering. Look at the things that Allah bids us to do. Allah bids us to have patience with suffering. He bids us to feed the poor, right? To help the downtrodden, et cetera, et cetera. Well, how do you feed the poor if there are none? How do you feed the starving if there are none? How do you raise up the downtrodden if there are none? How do you alleviate pain and suffering if everybody is living an idyllic existence? Now, don't get me wrong. We Muslims believe that there is a paradise, but it's one that you have to earn. The thing that I object to is the concept that basically is put forward by so many people that this earth should be paradise on earth, and somehow blame God for the fact that it's not. No, God has created paradise, but we have to earn it. Why does anybody deserve it? Dr. Ehrman stated that he does not believe in a God that creates suffering. I got that, and I sympathize with his struggle over this issue. But what is the alternative? I mean, we live in a world of opposites. Up, down, left, right, day, night, black, white, and yes, good and evil. There cannot be one without the other, and there will be suffering.
I just want to see if sorry, carry on.
Well, there will be suffering, and in a way, there are blessings from the suffering. Now, before somebody jumps on me and says, "Oh, you're crazy! How can there be blessings in suffering?" Well, look, think about it. I mean, think about it. When you're hungry and you eat, and the food assuages your hunger, you're grateful for it. When you're thirsty, even if you're dragging yourself through the desert, and dying of thirst, when you get the water you need, you're grateful for it. When you're suffering, look, Allah tells us, after hardship becomes ease. And right after that, what does he do? He repeats himself. He says, verily, after hardship comes ease. You will not appreciate the ease if you don't have the hardship preceding it. Anybody who has been unable to breathe knows the blessed relief of being able to open your mouth and take that gulp of air. Just think of the time somebody held you underwater in the swimming pool, right? And held you under a little bit too long. And you realize that, if this went on, you'd be in trouble. When you break that surface of the water and you gulp you gasp your breath of air, what's the first thing you think? You think, thank what? Thank God. What does an atheist think when they're starving and then they get food, when they're impoverished and then they're relieved of their poverty, when they're suffering pain and then they are relieved of their pain? What does an atheist think? Who do they think? To me, it's just kind of absurd. It's in our innate template to go from a period of suffering, hardship, denial, whatever, and thank God when it is relieved.
Mm-hmm.
So, Paul, in the Holy Quran, Allah teaches, whatever of good reaches you is from Allah, but whatever of evil befalls you, it is from yourself. Now, I quoted that in our talk. It's 479. An example of how the good to which humankind is bidden overrides the evil that is from ourselves is the very example Dr. Ehrman gave, the one that we're talking about now, starvation. If every Muslim in the world did as they are told and pays the poor due, known as zakat, both poverty and hunger would cease to exist. Now, you just said a minute ago that this is our problem, not God's problem, and that's the exact point right there. If everybody did as they should and paid zakat, poverty and hunger would cease to exist. But they don't. And let's remember that most non-Muslims don't either. And as a result, starvation and suffering ensue. It's tragic. But it is basically our fault. As I quoted in that ayat, whatever of evil befalls you, it is from yourself. And collectively, we are falling down on the job. However, at the same time, we have a book of Revelation, which, if followed, we would wipe out these, poverty and starvation. And that's evidence to the divine nature of the Quran. Mm. How do we explain the horrific suffering and loss of life that result from natural disasters? That's a different question. And that I felt was a point that Dr. Ehrman was particularly tuned in on, or particularly sensitive to. I do have the sense that Dr. Ehrman is sort of a tender-hearted soul, and I like that about him. I like the fact that he's thinking about these things, that he's concerned, and that he's seeking answers. And yet I cannot impart my beliefs better than what I have just been saying. However, what I would say is that when we're talking about the loss of life that results from natural disasters and the explanation thereof, is it fair for me to say, I don't know? In some sense, I think that's one of the things that Dr. Ehrman reacted to, is that, perhaps he felt I should know. But, here's the point. I mean, I accept Allah's decree, having faith that he knows best. When faced with any mystery, why do atheists say they don't know, but they have faith science will someday figure it out? But then they belittle believers who say basically the same thing, that we have faith that Allah knows best.
I was impressed. He had a huge amount of faith and trust that materialist, naturalistic, scientific processes will explain everything, human consciousness, everything. And there is a direct parallel there. That is a faith. And Muslims and others have faith in God as well. There's a different kind of trust, but nevertheless, they're both trusts of a kind, aren't they?
Exactly. And, if one person is allowed to argue ignorance and faith, the other should be allowed to do so as well. I mean, one puts their faith in science and says eventually someday, science will answer all these questions. Another person puts their faith in a creator. But yeah, that's, I think that's a bit of an aside. One thing I would point out, I'd go back to something I said earlier, and that is that I think it's very difficult to discuss this subject unless you're discussing from the same foundation of faith.
Yeah.
So, for example, in the Islamic traditions, we know that we as human beings were not the first ones to question Allah. Mm. Now, that might sound a little odd, but we do know in Revelation, the Holy Quran does tell us that when Allah announced to the angels that he was going to create mankind, the angels questioned him, now I cannot remember the exact translation, but it's along the lines of asking Allah if he was going to create a level of creation that would make fitna and bloodshed on earth. Well, what did Allah answered to the angels? And let's remember the level of the discussion here, or the level of the the entities that are involved. I mean, you're talking about Allah and the angels, which, of course, are far more elevated than we are. But what did Allah say to the angels by way of explanation? Did he give a logical explanation of what he was doing? No, he said that he knows best. He knows what they know not. And that is basically what I have been saying all along.
No, that's helpful, actually, to draw that parallel. Can I just mention an amazing hadith from Sahih Muslim, which I think goes some way to answering, from Islamic point of view, how God can allow the innocent to suffer in this world. And I read it from Guy Eaton's book, Islam and the Destiny of Man. Yeah, brilliant piece of writing. And he quotes the hadith, which I'll just read, if you don't mind, and just a couple of his comments. This is on page 239. He says, there is a hadith, and he quotes it. The man who had the pleasantest life in the world, so we are told, the most luxurious, the happiest, the most easygoing, the pleasantest life in the world, so we are told, would be dipped momentarily into hell on the day of resurrection. He will then be asked, son of Adam, did you ever experience any good? Did anything pleasant ever come your way? And he will reply, no, my Lord, I swear it. Then the man who, of all men, and we must say women and everyone, who had the most miserable life on earth, would be dipped momentarily into paradise. He will then be brought before his Lord and asked, son of Adam, did you ever have any misfortune? Did any distress ever come your way? And he will reply, no, my Lord, I swear it. No misfortune has ever come to me, and I have never known distress. That's the end of that quote, of that hadith. And then Guy Eaton says that this hadith offers, at least to those who are prepared to accept the possibility that there may be states of experience more real than anything we live through here, one answer to the question as to how God can allow the innocent to suffer in this world. If anyone were to awaken from a bad dream, full of fear and torment, to find himself at home beside his beloved, sunlight streaming through the window, a prospect of golden days before him, and all his deepest longings satisfied, for how long would he remember the pain of his dream? On the other hand, if he were to awaken from a dream of delight to find himself in an all too familiar prison cell, awaiting the next session of torture at the hands of merciless inquisitors, and quite without hope, dream pleasure would melt away in moments. Yeah. Whether it be sweet or sour, reality takes precedence over dreaming, and the greater reality takes precedence over the lesser. End quote. So he seems to be saying, Guy Eaton, that compared to the next life, he's not saying this life is a dream, I don't think at all, but the next life is the greater reality. And this is a lesser reality. And the next life compared to this one is like the real world, and ours is like the dreaming. And so the person in the next life will have a perspective which we don't have at the moment, perhaps, in this world. Just wanted to share that.
I think it's an excellent point. And, I also think that the, part of the conundrum, part of the difficulty that people have making sense of pain and suffering in this earth is, I noticed that Dr. Ehrman was particularly sensitive to the pain and suffering of the innocents. And one thing I'd point out is that, of course, there are a lot of people who are not as innocent as they appear. And yet, on the other hand, the problem goes back to the foundation of belief. If you're believing that this life is everything, we live and we die, and that's the end, then the suffering of the innocents is just one of many injustices in this life that you can point your finger at and say, well, life is just unjust, But if you believe, as we do, that there is an afterlife, then you understand that in the end, all injustices are rectified, and rectified in a way that is so beautiful and pleasant that you forget every injustice that was done. I mean, in line with the hadith that you were just quoting. I mean, right. it is said that those who suffer in this earth, when they are raised up to find their reward in front of Allah in the afterlife, they are so, they are so happy with the reward that they have found that they ask to go back to the earth to suffer again, to elevate their reward. But in the same way, those who lived a life of just debauchery and having everything you want in this life and so on, evil people who enjoyed their lives but not in a good way. When they reach the afterlife, they ask to be allowed to go back to life to rectify their deeds. And when they face punishment, they ask to be destroyed rather than to face the punishment. Mm-hmm. So yeah. But again, it all comes back to this issue of the foundation from which you are speaking. Mm-hmm. Dr. Ehrman, he made the point that just as humankind understands issues now, such as lightning, that it did not understand a couple hundred years ago, he has faith that science, as we discussed, will eventually explain entities we do not currently fully understand, such as the functioning of the brain. He pointed that out. And of course, I'm sure he would be the first to admit that anybody can claim their belief system will eventually figure everything out. But I have to whimsically propose that science might indeed eventually figure everything out and unequivocally conclude one day, I mean, wouldn't it be a hoot if science unequivocally concluded one day that, yes, the explanation is that there really is a God. And I think that actually could happen. And this was something I had wanted to discuss because looking at the futility of this subject of making sense of the pain and suffering in this life, understanding that you can only really sensibly argue this if it's in the framework of sharing a foundation of belief in a God and an afterlife. The primacy to me is to establish a belief in God in the first place. One subject I failed to touch upon in our talk was the multitude of evidences for the prophethood of Muhammad and the divine nature of the Quran.
Yes, please.
And
yeah.
Yeah, that really I felt was a big shortcoming on my part.
Yes. Well, you didn't have much time. To be fair on you, there wasn't endless hours and hours to go. There was a lot we didn't discuss. But I just want to. This is my favorite book that you've written. In my view, your magnum opus, your major work, the first and final commandment, a search for truth in revelation within the Abrahamic religions. You can still get this on Amazon and with other booksellers. But you, just on the very point you're about to address, I think, on the prophethood of Muhammad, upon whom be peace, in the Quran, the divine origin of the Quran, you do address that in more detail in your book, I think.
Exactly. And that book is rather long. As you said, it's a magnus opus. Exactly. and so some people suggested that
long is good. For me, long is good. Short is not so good.
Well, short, some people did suggest that I cut it in half, and that's what I did. I rewrote it. I rewrote it in 2 volumes. Let me just gather them up here. So the first half is called Misguided, and that is subtitled A Roadmap of Guidance and Misguidance Within the Abrahamic Faith. Uh-huh. And the second part is Guided, and this is an argument, the case for Islam as the completion of revelation. And it's in both the book that you mentioned and in this one as the latter half of that, and I'm just going to read you some of the some of the chapter titles. Okay, so regarding the Holy Quran, what I deal with is the history of the Quran, an overview, the innate appeal, the language of the Quran, the relation of revelation to preceding events, the relation of revelation to contemporaneous events, the relation of revelation to subsequent events, revelation of the unknown, and then I go on in speaking of the prophets, in speaking of the prophethood of Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, a chapter on miraculous signs, portending his prophethood, miracles performed through him, character, persistence and steadfastness, lack of disqualifiers. That's a very important one, because if you find one disqualifier, that basically nixes the whole thing. Maintenance of the message. Now, in these chapters, I basically enumerate over 60 evidences for the divine nature of the Quran.
60, 6 zeros. Wow.
60, but believe it or not, well, I'm sure you know, Paul, actually. I mean, that's the tip of a massive iceberg of evidences. But using these 60 evidences alone and assigning each one a ridiculously high probability of 50%, the chance that these 60 evidences would all come true by chance alone, random events alone, works out to 1 in a quintillion. That's 10 to the 18th power. So that's basically a 1 followed by 18 zeros. Now, that is why that's why I say that I came to faith through the combination of experience and reason. As I said earlier, I would come back to this point, and here we are. My point is that once people come to rational belief in our divine creator, they cannot disavow God on the basis of the presence of pain and suffering in this world. Why? Because belief in our creator removes all doubt. The creation cannot question the creator's design, because the creation is the creator's design. It's like a painting telling the painter he doesn't know what he's doing, or a sculpture, a sculptor coming to life and telling the sculptor he doesn't know what he's doing. It's nuts.
In the Bible, as a similar analogy, it's the clay arguing with the potter about why are you making me like this? And the clay is protesting to the potter. Well, sorry, the potter has a right to do that.
There you go. I mean, Allah teaches us in the Quran, quote, "And I did not create the jinn and mankind except to worship me," and that's 51:56. And if you really internalize that we are not created except to serve and worship our Creator, and you combine that with what I was saying earlier about simply the fact that it's not our job to question the Creator. The fact that when the angels asked Allah about his creation of mankind, along with what? Fitna, bloodshed, whatever else might come along, Allah's answer was not a rational explanation, but just simply the statement of his supremacy, that he knew what they knew not.
I mean, we find this also in the Jewish Bible, in the incredible book of Job. Who Job undergoes immense amounts of suffering and pain. You get chapter after chapter, and his accusers accuse. Where's your fault, mate? You must have done something terrible. God's punishing you, basically. And he goes on and on. Anyway, and at the very end, and I'll let the viewers see what the answer is. But God suddenly speaks. Finally, God, who's been the background to this, speaks to the world about what really happened and what is Job innocent? Is he guilty? And so on. And the answer he gives is totally consistent with what you've just said, Dr. Brown. So I'm hearing this from both the Jewish Bible. The potter and the clay thing comes from the New Testament, actually. And so here we have the Abrahamic faith speaking in unison, at least in those 3 examples, on this question. But the book of Jonah is traditionally seen as the main Jewish response to why do the innocent suffer in this world? And God does answer at the end of the book, if you look it up.
Yeah, and the question of innocence is not the issue. I mean, the issue is, okay, a person can be innocent and still suffer tragedy.
Mm.
A person can obviously be be sinful, and if they're purified of their sins through suffering in this life, they're lucky, because far better to suffer a pain or punishment in this rather transient, this short life, than to suffer the punishment in the afterlife, which is enduring.
And even in the Gospels, I mean, whether or not they contain historically reliable material, there's a fascinatingly and frustratingly brief episode where Jesus is asked about a bunch of Jews, we don't know who they are, Israelites, who a tower fell on them. And I can't remember the exact reference, but it's easy to find. Were they guilty? Were they being punished for their sins, or was it their parents' sins? What was God doing? It's like a natural disaster. In a way, that this tower fell on people, and Jesus gives an answer, and I'll let people look it up. But so the question is even addressed by Jesus in the Gospels, according to the Gospels. I'm not saying it historically. I don't see any problem with his answer, by the way, but that's the answer anyway that he gave. So this is a theme that comes up in the Abrahamic faiths repeatedly.
Yeah, and the thing is that we can play mental games in trying to figure out why some people suffer and others do not. I mean, one thing that I think that we can make sense of is that people are tested in different ways. Some people would fail the test of poverty and succeed at the test of wealth. Other people, the other way around. They would fail at the test of wealth and succeed at the test of poverty. As I mentioned before, again, Allah tells us in the Holy Quran that if He gave people, things in excess, that they would turn to sins and transgression and tyranny. And we see this among people given too much.
Well, this is a very important point I think you're making here. It's not just what does the trial always do is suffering. It's actually different kinds of tests and trial for different kinds of people. People who have great wealth, have been blessed, have been given opportunities, income, and so on. That also, the Quran explicitly says in a number of ayat I've read, is actually a test for them. Will they be will they hoard the money? Will they credit themselves with being successful, or will they share their wealth and their blessings with other people? And will they be thankful? The Quran says, will they be thankful? Will they show gratitude? So that's a test as well, not just the innocent suffering. So test really applies to everyone, arguably. Well, the Quran says it applies to everyone.
And by the way, one of the biggest tests in this life is patience.
Mm.
And this is something that we all are bidden to at times. But a lot of the test in this life, a lot of the adversity we face is conquered only with patience.
That is the Quran's prescription. That God will then bless and reward those who have sabr, have patience. That is the solution very often, is to show patience rather than react in a very different way.
Well, to my knowledge, patience is the only thing that Allah describes in the Quran that He will reward without limit. Mm-hmm. Exactly that. It's interesting that we are all put to trial in our religion. I mean, our religion bids us, the religion of Islam, but other religions as well. And please excuse me there. That's the call to prayer that you might be hearing.
This is in Medina, by the way, folks. This is Dr. Lawrence in Medina hearing the call to prayer. How amazing is that?
But yeah. What was I saying? Oh yeah, about the issue of patience. So, our the things we do in our faith. I mean, Ramadan, the patience and the deprivation of fasting. Now, I find this very interesting because this is something that, as a religious person, that you are supposed to do, and yet you could cheat on it I mean, you could eat or drink behind closed doors and nobody would know that you are not fasting. But I find Ramadan fascinating from this point because, in some respects, because it teaches the believer abstention. It teaches them patience. It teaches them some touch. Not the complete feeling that a person would feel who is starving, but it teaches them something of the pain and deprivation of that state to basically motivate them to feel with those who are less well off. And when you finish Ramadan and you successfully complete this 30 days of fasting during the days from sunrise to sunset, you feel a sense of accomplishment, and you feel in some way ennobled. And this was a point I was making with Dr. Ehrman, is that anybody who strives against adversity, when they come out on the other side of that and succeed, the story of Job, but certainly lesser examples. When you come out on the other side of that and you succeed, you feel a better person for it. And that's in general true when we take any adversity upon ourselves, whether it's just giving money to the poor that you would rather hold on to ourselves. Is that a true adversity? Well, it stings. It's, you feel something from giving up your hard-earned money. And yet, there's always the question, coming back to what you said earlier, there's always the question about the suffering of the innocents. What about the suffering of the innocents? And I love the hadith you read, because I think that really captures the spirit of things. That this is a test for them. It can be a test just of their patience. It can be tremendous suffering. But in the same way that people who have gone through Ramadan come out on the other side of the Ramadan, having successfully completed the task, feel to some extent ennobled by it. When you talk to people who have suffered any horrifying adversity, whether it was the death march during World War II, or torture during captivity, or a tsunami, or prolonged starvation, or whatever, when you talk to the survivors of those experiences, you really get very opposite stories. Some people are very bitter and saying, how can there be a God that made me suffer like that? Well, they failed the test. And then others find, as I said, that having maintained their patience and persevered during that hardship, they feel ennobled by it. They feel a better person. And for many of them, their life has changed in a positive direction. And the last thing I would say is something that we all know, and that is that for many people who have suffered through severe periods of adversity, it is transformative. Many of them go from disbelief to belief, and they look back and they say, I lost everything that was unimportant in this world, and I gained the only thing that was important, and that was belief. I'll tell you just kind of a funny story, and this is not somebody who starved or suffered tremendously, but it's just kind of something that happened to me. I met this brother and sister who were very opposite. Now the brother was kind of weak in his religion. Well, let's be honest, he was quite weak in his religion. And the sister was very strong in her religion. And the brother was complaining to me that the sister, now you might be wondering, why am I meeting a sister? This was many years ago, and I was being introduced for the possibility of marriage. But in any case, the brother complained that the sister would make dua, as he put it, she's making dua against me, supplication. She's asking Allah to remove from me whatever keeps me from this religion, to bring me closer to Him. And that was his attitude. His attitude was that, she's making dua against her attitude, being the religious one, or the more religious one, shall we say. Her attitude was, look, whatever you lose in this world, for the blessing of drawing closer to Allah is worth it. And everybody who goes through that, when they look back, they would multiply the transaction 10, 100, 1,000 times, because once you taste, or once you experience the opening of your heart and the mind and the conviction that comes with turning to God, you realize that anything in your life that kept you from that was just purely an obstruction and just not worth it. And by the way, we've gotten a little bit far afield. I don't want to lose our position totally, but I was pointing out, when I was talking about the evidences in my book, that, as I said, if you take just those 60 evidences and say that by random events, each one would have had a 50-50 chance of coming true, and work it out, it comes to one chance in a quintillion that all of those evidences could have come true by chance alone. The fascinating thing about the Quran is that there is nothing in the Quran that has ever been proven to be inconsistent or false. There is nothing that you can assail to say, well, that's definitely an error. There are things that perhaps, have not come true yet, like speaking about signs of Yom HaKiyamah, of the Day of Judgment and so on, but there is nothing assailable. And so this tip of the iceberg is very representative. As a scientist, we define research by confidence intervals, the most common one being p less than 0.05. But when you're talking about 1 in a quintillion, you're talking about 18 zeros. You're not talking about a confidence interval less than 0.05. You're talking about a confidence interval less than 0.000, 0.00000000000000001. Now, if we are defining our research by confidence intervals of 0.05, why can't I say this evidence overwhelms 0.05? So I think it's very scientific, it's very logical to accept this evidence as, in the scientific community, if you're using those numbers statistically to prove anything else, you would say, oh, well, that's proof. So I would say that's proof of the divinity of the Quran. And, can I give you a taste of the sort of evidences I'm talking about?
Please do. Please do.
Just for example, in speaking about the Quran in relation to previous events, one charge that is made against the Quran, a lot of disbelievers will say, well, the Quran is just copying stories from the Bible.
Yeah.
A lot of problems with that. Number one is that during the time of Muhammad, there was no Arabic Bible to copy from. It didn't exist. Another problem is that although there were Christians with their oral, traditions, the vast majority of them were Nestorians or Monophysites, which represented basically heretical versions of Christianity. And yet the Quran did not represent the attitudes of the Monophysites or the Nestorians. Okay, the Quran did not say that Jesus was a phantasm or any of these things. No, the Quran represented the views that you find preserved in Unitarian and Trinitarian Christianity to this day. Yeah. So that really is, that's really a very difficult argument to put forward once you know the evidence against it. But in the stories that the Quran tells, relating similar stories or the same story as what is related in the Bible, the key is this. The key is that the Quran corrects things that the Bible got wrong.
Yeah.
So, for example, in the story of Joseph, right? The Bible describes the owner, Joseph's owner as he was a slave, as Pharaoh. Well, the Quran describes his master as the king of Egypt. Well, during the time of Joseph, the Hyksos dynasty was ruling, not the pharaohs. The Hyksos dynasty never referred to their leaders as pharaoh. They referred to their leaders as king. The king of Egypt was the king of Egypt, not the pharaoh. So this is the kind of small example. It's this small little detail that historians would trip a toe over and make a little mistake and carry that mistake on if they were copying from an incorrect record. But to correct that mistake is highly significant. I feel like I'm dominating here, and I'm sorry, but I'd just like to say one more. Now, that's one example of talking about something in the past. Let's talk about something that was contemporaneous to the revelation of the Quran. The revelation of the Quran included a passage which described that Abu Lahab and his wife would be in the fire. Well, now, Abu Lahab was a hater of the Islamic religion. Anything that Muhammad said, he would say the opposite. He tried to discredit and destroy the religion by any means possible.
So he had the power in his hands, like a nuclear weapon, to destroy Islam. I'm anticipating your point here, didn't he? In a sense, all he had to do was contradict. Exactly. All he had to do was he could destroy the Quran just like that if he wanted.
All he had to do was stand up and say, "I'm a believer." Okay, because the Quran was saying that he would be in the fire, and it's a fundamental teaching in Islam that all Muslims will eventually be in paradise. So all he had to do was stand up and say, "Oh, well, your book says what? Your book says that I will be in the fire. Oh, well, in that case, I'm a Muslim. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. What do you say now?" Okay, and he would have effectively destroyed the religion. And here's the interesting thing. Historically, we know that his friends tried to goad him into it. His friends tried to push him into it. Now, this is something that a lot of people don't know. But both he and his wife, people tried to push him into it. They saw what he could do.
Yeah.
But both him and his wife refused for the remainders of their lives to enter Islam, even though it was their habit to do the exact opposite of anything that Muhammad said, even though they did everything in their power to try to destroy the religion.
Yeah.
So how is it possible? How could I ever say to you, Paul, as me, a human being, you, a human being, how could I ever say, Paul, I will never allow these words to pass your lips? And yet that is exactly what the revelation said. Now, what's the chance of that? 50%? That's why I say that taking these evidences and assigning them a probability of 50% is absolutely absurd. Abu Lahab and his wife had years to think about this, and friends pushing them into it. All they had to do was say the words, and they did. What's the chance of that?
Even as hypocrites, even as liars, just making the statement would have been enough. But they had the nuclear option, and they just didn't use it, just exactly as the Quran said they wouldn't.
And then there are passages that speak of events that to come true in the future. which came true. There are passages that deal with the unknown, scientific evidences that we've only figured out within the last few decades, and on and on and on. It's kind of like, I mean, how much do you need to convince you? If you're not willing to accept a p-value of basically 1 in a quintillion, what confidence interval do you need? So,
absolutely. Well, okay. Well, so do you have anything else you wanted to add there?
No, I think I think the last thing that I would just mention is there is this hadith which I think is worth mentioning, and it is simply, I want to read this, not hadith, I'm sorry, quotation from Quran. I want to read this just because, as I said, I do feel that Dr. Ehrman, by my perception, is a very logical person, very rational in some respects, but I think he obviously has, he has the rather typical atheist view of things, and I feel he's a gentle-hearted soul in the respect that he is very concerned about the issue of suffering, and that is what has sort of beaten the faith out of him. So the question is, again, about the innocence, and the quotation is this: what did Allah intend by this as an example? Excuse me, I have to back up. Again, let me go to my cheat sheet here. Okay. Indeed, Allah is not timid to present an example. That's what I meant to lead off with, excuse me. Indeed, Allah is not timid to present an example, that of a mosquito or what is smaller than it. And those who have believed know that it is the truth from their Lord, but as for those who disbelieve, they say, what did Allah intend by this as an example? He misleads many thereby and guides many thereby. And he misbelieved, and he misleads not, except the defiantly disobedient who break the covenant of Allah after contracting it and sever that which Allah has ordered to be joined and cause corruption on earth. It is those who are the losers. And what greater corruption on earth is there than severing that which Allah has ordered to be joined, namely the connection between Allah and his servants? And that, of course, is what atheism is all about.
Exactly. Now, I remember actually reading that very verse a couple of days ago. Actually, I was very struck by it then as well. Well, thank you very much indeed, Dr. Lawrence Brown, for expanding on many of these subjects and clarifying some details, and absolutely marvelous. And I do recommend viewers obtain this if they haven't already, the First and Final Commandment. Lots of gems, that's the right word, in it, covering all the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and lots of evidences for Islam itself. And there's much good in that, I think. So thank you for that. And well, thank you very much for coming back and returning to discuss God's suffering and the purpose of life. And I hope viewers will benefit hugely from this time with Dr. Brown. So thank you again very much indeed, Dr. Brown, for your time.
My pleasure. And if you don't mind, I just want to say one last thing, and that's just on a personal note. It's just, I gave my email at the beginning, ask Dr. Brown at yahoo.com. Doctor is just DR. Okay, ask Dr. Brown at yahoo.com. But the thing I wanted to say is, please respect the fact that I am a bit of a recluse. I love questions, and I love criticism. Criticism is something I can build off of. It's something that I can improve myself with. I would ask people to refrain from, laying on too thick any appreciations and so on. This is kind of poison for the heart.
Yep. No,
and I find it demotivating. And I also tend to get a flood of people asking for donations and money, and I have to say, please, that just won't work. I only give to charities that are approved in the United States, my country of origin, and I am basically, that's just my policy is not to donate personally. So that's about it. Yeah. I look forward to any constructive criticism. And Paul, I'd like to thank you so much for these talks. I feel that they're helpful to all of us, even to myself. I enjoy the opportunity to express myself. So, thank you.
Well, folks, leave some comments below. I know Dr. Brown reads them, and do leave your comments underneath this video. So, thank you very much, Dr. Brown, and good night to you all. Till next time.